Hi, and welcome to the Rob Moore's Leadership Untitled Podcast, the show that brings along an expert in the world of leadership and/or L&D and shares the insights and their experiences, so hopefully leaders out there can avoid the same traps that me and my guests have fallen into ourselves in the past. My guest this week is Peter Cheese, the CEO of CIPD, as well as being an executive fellow for the London Business School and also an author. I'm really excited about this conversation, as I think there's a number of grey areas when it comes to leadership, and normally those grey areas are between the theory, the best practice, and reality. Now, Peter experiences all of those as he represents, obviously, the best practices of the CIPD, but also he is the person with all eyes on him from inside and outside that organisation as he leads it. So how far can theory take you, and how difficult is leadership at the moment in the current times we all live within? And what's the role of L&D and HR in that? So, time to get that chat started. I'd like to welcome Peter to the podcast. Hi Peter, thanks for joining the Leadership Untitled podcast today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for joining so much. I'm really pleased to be able to invite you to, and really pleased that you said yes to come along, because I'm really excited about this conversation, really, for one big reason, and that is for me that not only do you represent the kind of CIPD vision of what great leadership is, and now obviously that then ties into HR and L&D and its own leadership, but also as the CEO of the CIPD, you've probably got a whole load of bunch of stories about your own leadership journey, and probably, like I've done in some episodes with others, that the mistakes you've made as a leader and how they've maybe made you a better leader. So I guess that, that theory versus reality is going to come into it a little bit today. But I guess first of all, if I could get a little bit more into your background. I guess you're best known as the CEO now as for CIPD, but how did you get into doing what you do? Why is it you do it, and what led you to the CIPD?
I suppose it goes back into what I was interested in as a child. I'm a son of two doctors, a lot of medics in my family, and I've always been interested in, I suppose, people from that perspective. I decided early on not to be a doctor, which I think is a very good thing for me and probably a very good thing for medicine in general. But I went to university and studied ergonomics, which is actually all about people together with systems, and so we did a lot on engineering and organization, systems design, things like that, but also studied a lot about people, psychology, physiology, anatomy. And actually, I think it's a good summary of what I've always believed. The world of work, however you picture it, is always about people working within some system and trying to get the best out of people and the best for people through that. So I suppose I've always described myself, therefore, as a bit of a humanist. I just fascinated by, as I said, people in lots of different ways. I then went into consulting, and I spent, after university, 30 glorious years working at a big consulting firm, which didn't start being called Accenture, but by the time I left, it was called Accenture. Worked all around the world, lots of different things, did a lot with technology over those years, many different industry sectors. But my last 8 years there were running their global practice in, broadly speaking, all of the people side of business. So HR, leadership, culture, organization, all those things. And as I said, that's always been my real interest. And then when I left Accenture in 2009, I then did a bit of a portfolio of things, including bits teaching. I also chaired the Institute of Leadership and Management, and a few other organizations. I had a bit of a portfolio, as I said. And then along came this opportunity in 2012, and I was delighted to be appointed as CEO. I think this is an incredibly important, I said it from day one, an incredibly important time for our profession. Because at the end of the day, going back to my early comments, this is about how we make the world of work the best it can be for people. Because if we do that, then we support people at work, then they will be productive and they will produce the right outcomes for organizations, and indeed even beyond that into economies and society. So I suppose that's what sort of motivates me. And now we're in this extraordinary time of change, which I'm sure we'll talk a bit more about.
Oh yeah, massive amount of change at the minute, isn't there? I mean that is I guess that is the age-old kind of conundrum when it comes to leadership and business leadership. It's, as I like to call it, the mission versus the people. And I think more than ever, there seems to be this swing towards that people are the most important asset within an organization. And if you focus on those, the results and the mission will come because they'll be more inclined to deliver it for you. But at the same time, which again, I'm sure we'll get into as we go through the podcast, there still is this status quo, this kind of like knee-jerk reaction back to, well, hang on a minute, we're a results business. We need to get back to making sure we achieve X, Y, and Z. And from my point, it tends to be, or I see when it tends to be, it's when the pressure hits. I don't know if you've got the same opinion.
It can be, Rob, yeah, because when the pressure hits, then the first thing we tend to do, of course, is look at costs, and then we start to think of everything as a cost. And in my experience of a business over a lot of years, I mean, I think the reality is that if you go back 10, 15, 20 years, an awful lot of organizational thinking was about standardization, about processes, about technology. And people weren't really sort of front and center. They were part of the system, of course, but they were very much thought of as a cost and not as a value. We were driven for many years by somebody I've often quoted, Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winning economist, who back in the 70s said, the sole purpose of business was to make money. So I think there's an awful lot of that cultural thinking in organizations for many decades, where people weren't really front and center of the thinking. Now, the last 10 years, I think there's been a shift, and there's no doubt in my mind that the pandemic is accelerating that.
100%.
Put people more front and center. But then we've also got to make sure that we're clearly articulating and understanding the value of people in an organization, understanding the value of investing in people. So, for example, training is another, and learning is another good example. Always seen as a cost line item and often a soft target because we've not been very good at articulating the value to the enterprise. So you're quite right. When times get hard, the horizons come in, it becomes short-term focused, we become more risk averse, and then we start doing the easiest things, frankly, for business leaders to do, which is to find ways to cut costs. And since in most businesses in the modern world, people and all the attendant costs of people make up the majority of the cost base in a more services-driven economy, then it's very easy to just think of people in those sorts of ways, particularly, as you said, when times are hard.
Definitely. I mean, it's interesting that the quote you've mentioned there for Milton Friedman, because it is the direct opposite. You mentioned the last 10 years, the focus has started to change. Well, it's the last 10 years, I guess, that Simon Sinek has come to a lot more prominence. And he actually very, very bluntly puts, it's not the purpose of business to earn the money. That's the result of what you do. And I think it is his analogy is you don't buy a car to put fuel in it. You buy a car to actually go on the journey and get somewhere, but fuel's an essential part of that journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, he talks a great deal about purpose and what is the purpose of the organization, asking why, and why we're here, what are we here to do? And of course, nobody's denying that for commercial business, you have to make money because otherwise you're not going to survive. Of course, that's an important thing. But I'm very taken, always have been very taken by these ideas of the multi-stakeholder view of organizations and business, and that it is not a single purpose of an organization to make money. You have to understand it from these different stakeholder views. So who are your customers? What are you trying to do and how you're supporting and serving them? How you work with your suppliers, how you work as an organization as part of communities, which we're all part of and part of society. And indeed, of course, understanding our impact on environment and things like that. So, and last and certainly not least, of course, as a stakeholder of a business, are the people that are engaged with that organization that we employ or that we contract or that we engage with the business of the organization. So I think it's that much more pluralistic view, if you will, about what we're here to do, the purpose of it, recognizing that businesses really do have responsibilities, not just to all of their stakeholders, but to behave ethically and responsibly as well. And if we do those things as organization and business leaders, then we help to give good environments for people to work in, which is good for them, but also, as I said, it helps us truly play our part as business in healthy and productive societies. And that is something that I've always believed in.
Absolutely. I mean, just as you're talking there, it actually made me think of that kind of society impact a little bit, because in some ways, I guess we're going around in a cycle here. That I can remember that certainly when I was a very young lad, the sort of businesses that were local to me. I live in a little town called Congleton in Cheshire, and for those listening, you probably know Stoke or Crewe or Macclesfield better than that place, but it's right next to them. And we had a little event called a carnival that happens every 2 years. But at one point, it was, I think I'm right in saying it was the biggest carnival in Britain. But what it was, it's all the local businesses and all the people within those local businesses supported it and supported the community through it. They would all build their own floats. And honestly, the line of these floats were going for miles and miles and miles going through the town centre. Now, I guess as society has expanded in terms of how far you can reach as an individual and as a company now. And I guess, you know, the big companies and the multinational companies and the multi-product companies are much more prominent than the kind of local butcher and the local ribbon maker as it was back then. How much more difficult is it now? Because I mean, the Congleton Carnival still happens, but you don't see a W.H. Smith float and you don't see a TSB float or whatever it might be. It's a non-event in some respects, but then people did care. So, you know, I see companies with values on the wall and in their papers. I see companies talking about these things. And more often than not, how do I get people to care as much as I do about this business? Where have we gone from there to now? And what's that challenge?
Yeah, I think there are, you know, lots of shifts that have been happening. I mean, first of all, to your point about sort of locality, I absolutely agree. It's really important. And first observation is that, you know, more than 2/3 of people of the workforce work in a small to medium-sized business. You know, so 250 employees or less is the definition we give to it here. And actually, many of them are in micro businesses and even self-employed. So that actually makes up the majority of the workforce. And so, in that sense, then having those local connections between businesses and, you know, others like, you know, the local chambers of commerce, local councils, and further education. You know, I've done a lot recently in that sector. I think it's really important now to recognize the power of local community. And I'm encouraged, actually, in many ways, if you look up and down the country, to see in many different parts of the country sort of saying, look, we've got agency. We're not powerless to change things and improve things, and to work more collectively and collaboratively with our local businesses, supporting each other, helping, you know, local people to gain the right skills by working, for example, with the FE colleges and the like. So I think that's a very important dynamic. And you're right that so much of business and business thinking and what people write about has been very focused on big, large corporations, and what they do to influence the world, which of course is significant. But the real power for many people and the reality for many people are these smaller businesses. So then, you know, it's not to say that although we have studied a lot of big businesses, and we mentioned Simon Sinek and others, Jim Collins and several, will have talked a great deal about big businesses. Of course, you can take those same principles into small business as well. And the idea of, you know, so what is my purpose as a small business and a small business owner? What am I here to do? How do I best look after all my different stakeholders, my customers, and of course my employees, my suppliers, and so forth? They equally apply to small businesses. And am I clear on my values and my principles and what I believe in? Because, you know, it is true that people, you know, they join organizations and they leave bosses. So, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're a big or a small company, you've still got to make sure that you're creating a, you know, culture in your business which people want to relate to, that they're attracted by, and they want to stay loyal to. So I think, as I said, all of those principles apply, whatever size of business. But I do think that, going back to that point of sort of more localization, that I think that is where we will see the real strength of our economy for many businesses, when we connect better in these sorts of local communities, which then, you know, can all wire up into the bigger sort of national or supranational view. But I think a lot of it starts actually quite locally.
No, absolutely. I've seen I guess over the last 20 years, I've been a part of a number of startup companies, I probably call them. And then equally, on top of that, I've known friends who have been members of senior teams in startup companies. And to your point, that those that seem to succeed and really gather momentum with the ones that were clear on that purpose, and they had a purpose bigger than just the product that they were selling. And to that point, really, I think to myself, when the small businesses are doing so well at the start, a lot of the things that we as L&D and HR practitioners and CIPD talk about is done inherently by the leaders that are within that small organization. They're looking after the people, they're looking after the kind of processes, they're making sure everyone's got the equipment and the skills they need to do the job, etc., etc., etc. So really, for me, it's kind of, amongst other things like the product and how we're going to sell the product, it's massively important to leaders at that time. What I notice, and I'm interested in your point of view on this, is that when we get to a certain point, and most companies who grow and suddenly need things like HR and L&D, they grow very quickly in that respect. And suddenly, rather than 10 people in a garage somewhere, it's 100 people in an office. And at that point, it almost feels sometimes that senior leaders, I guess the word almost would be, they abdicate responsibility for people to the HR function. They give leadership responsibility and accountability to the other things as well, to other people like product and sales and support and all that. But at the same time, they feel accountable for that still. Whereas sometimes I see that maybe they don't feel as accountable for the people element. They seem to abdicate it all. Is that what you find?
Yeah, I think it sort of goes back, Rob, to that sort of earlier observation that in many organizations and in many people's minds that, you know, people are an asset or resource, and the thing that really matters is, am I getting the product out of the door? Am I managing my costs effectively? Is cash flow working? You know, am I penetrating markets I want to? And of course, those things are absolutely fundamental to any business, but they're all still enacted through people. And I do think, yes, part of the challenge is that we haven't always taught, you know, whenever we train people in business, and I talk a lot of business schools, I say, well, at what point in the curriculum are you going to talk to them about people, about culture, about leadership, about organizational behavior? Because, you know, we all understand the finance stuff and the marketing strategies and product strategies, and yet we need to see people as elemental to that. I think with smaller businesses, it's intriguing because many small business owners haven't been to business school, they haven't studied business. So they're working on these sorts of fundamentals, which the most important thing, as I said, is to manage your costs, get the cash flow right, get your product out the door. And so you're sort of rather relying on them in terms of their own instinct and belief. And of course, there are many small business owners who absolutely fundamentally believe in the importance of people and how, you know, we look after them, create the right cultures, and they will continue to perpetuate that forwards. But equally, that's not universal. And to your point, yes, I think what happens, we did some research on this a number of years ago about the growth of companies from when you got 5 people up to 20 people, or certain sort of inflection points. You know, once you get beyond 5 or around that number, you're running out of friends and family to employ. So one of the first things you get to with a micro business is quite literally, oh my goodness, I've got to go and recruit somebody. How do I do that? And that can be a constraint if you've never done it before. And then the next level tends to be around 20 or so, because by then you've probably got to put a little bit of structure in. You might have a layer or so of management. So if I was the business owner growing the business where I've always known everybody, interacted with everybody kind of reports through to me, now maybe I've got to put a little bit more structure in. And then, of course, you get to 50 plus, and then you start to get into the space you described, where I might start to create more of these functions of support, one of which could be HR. Now, in creating HR in that regard, it's not about an abdication of my role as a leader to look after the people, or indeed a manager at any level. But I recognize what you're saying. I've seen it as well, that sometimes organizations think, right, but it's HR's job to sort of worry about all the people stuff, and we're going to worry about the money or the product or whatever it is. And the reality is we all need to worry about the people. And it's a fundamental role of leaders and managers at every level to understand, look after and support and coach their people. So sometimes small businesses just need a little bit of help to be reminded of that. We did some work a couple of years ago on what we call the People Skills Program, which is specifically to try to find the channels to small businesses in different localities. We had a pilot running in Hackney in East London. We had another one in Stoke and another one in Glasgow. And we were just trying to understand what are the critical things that small businesses need help on, and what's the best channel to get it to them. And of course, and we involved our members in that. We gave some of these small businesses a few free days of support. The first thing to observe is with small businesses, they don't tend to talk about HR problems. They just talk about business problems. Business problem, I can't find the skills I need, or I don't know how to recruit somebody. But sometimes it's just a sort of basic reminder of some fundamental things which are true for every business, that if you look after your people, if you care about things they care about, they'll care about things that you care about. And some of us get that instinctively, others less so. And I think we just need to make sure they're always reminding and coaching and supporting and finding the channels of support to small businesses to help them understand some of those fundamentals as well.
Yeah, it's about getting in there early and scaling the way that you want to do it in that respect, because I mean, caring about your people needs to become that second nature, because you're quite right. So many of those kind of senior leaders that get to that kind of, I guess you were talking about maybe that sort of 50 people figure, I do hear them say they just don't seem to care as much about it as I do. Now, my take on that tends to be, no, and they probably won't. For the same reason you've probably set up your own business. You didn't care about as much doing it for someone else. You set up your own business. They're not going to care as much of it, or rather, it should be, they're not going to care in the same way, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting debate. I mean, I'm quite a fan of models like employee-owned organizations where people do genuinely get a real sort of share, as it were, in the business. But I've heard that too. I mean, obviously, if you start your own business, you're deeply invested in it. Not just financially, psychologically, and it's your baby and all the rest of it. But that also is where you have to learn where you've got to let go. And this is another very challenging thing, not just for small business owners. I mean, I say leaders all the time. You have to let go and empower and trust people. And obviously, if it's your baby because it's your business, that is a big thing to overcome. And then you'll hear that sort of rhetoric. Well, I can't fully trust them because they don't understand it all, or they're not as deeply involved in the business as I am. But as I said, that's not unique to small businesses. I mean, one of my observations of business over the years has been that we haven't trusted enough, we haven't empowered enough, and we've tried to run organizations with lots of rules to control people's behavior, and then wondered why our people don't think they're being trusted or not given a voice, because we've had that sort of command and control way of thinking. So actually that idea of a leader needing to be able to get to a point where they can empower, they can let go, they can trust, they can therefore see their role as supporting, not doing all the time. It is a fundamental shift, and it's arguably a little harder, as you said, when it's your own business and you kicked it off. But it's been, as I said, an observation of mine for many years that a lot of leaders struggle with that construct. And yet that is how we have to work businesses. And now through the pandemic, interestingly, I think a lot more people have learned even more that, you've got to empower, you've got to let go, you've got to trust, because you cannot monitor people all the time.
All the people are trying to monitor them still. All the people are trying to monitor them still, and that's really destroyed the trust. So it's properly polarized it. We either now it's very clear that you do trust us, or it's very clear that you don't.
That you don't, no, absolutely. And I think on the positive side, the coronavirus pandemic has taught us, because a lot of this remote working things, we have got to trust and empower people to get on, and then we'll judge them by what they produce, not by how many hours they're present. So breaking this very long-standing corporate cultural legacy of presenteeism, and that's how we're judging people. And as I said, feeling that the way to get the best out of people is to write rules to control them rather than trusting and empowering them, which goes all the way back to what we talked about at the beginning, which is that thinking about people as people, not as assets or resources or widgets to be controlled. And which is not to say you don't have any rules. And there's a very interesting debate going on, and has been for a while, about these sort of holocracies and democratic workplaces and removing all the rules. And it has some merit because it's challenging us from a very different direction. But I think in most businesses you got to figure out what are the guidelines, what are the degree to which you do need rules. But then, as I said, really try to work to a culture where you're expecting people to take their own accountability for what you've made hopefully clear to them in terms of their role and objectives, and you're trusting and empowering them. And that's, we know, are the motivators of people at work, and we know that's what people expect to be treated at, particularly the younger generations that come into work.
It's interesting that the language used there, saying like rules and should we have rules or not. That there's a really nice story. I think it was from the 90s of the coach of the US basketball team for the Olympics, a guy called Coach K. And he realized that because he wasn't actually in the same kind of professional league as all these, we'll call them amateur basketball players, even though they were the best basketball players on the planet for the US. But he realized he couldn't go in there with a rule book and say, do this, don't do that, don't do that. So he actually said, no, this is going to be about standards. And instead, he had a couple of standards. Now, I apologize to whoever I need to apologize to for getting it wrong, but I think it was something along the lines of always tell the truth and always look the person in the eye that you're talking to, something along those lines. And you kind of say how many rules then are eliminated if you do actually just follow the standards that are put out there.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do believe in those philosophies. I think that I talk about them as principles rather than just standards, but the idea, so let's go back to the why stuff. I mean, so what do you believe in? What are your values? What principles would you want to embed and embody through the organization? Trying to give people a space to have autonomy, which we know is a principal driver of motivation, not constrain them, but to give them autonomy. You've also got to trust them with, say, what's the vision, the direction, how does their role fit to the wider objectives, and all those other things. So those are, I think, really, really important, and moving beyond a world which has been rather too rule-bound. And then, speaking to our own profession, HR, I think, we've been somewhat guilty of that ourselves. I mean, there was a management culture, definitely, that said, fundamentally, you've got to write rules because you've got to sort of eliminate all the vagaries of human behavior and just make sure people do what they're told to do. HR rather went along with that, and I think for a long period of time, HR saw its role more as controlling the people, controlling the risk of people, and there's no denying, that part of HR's job is to manage people risk, but it should see itself as an enabling and an empowering function. And then the model that I've always rather liked is the military model, because a lot of people think, well, if you want to see command and control, isn't that how the military works? But actually, no, it's shifted an awful lot into what they talk about as mission command and mission objective, and empowering teams on the ground, multidisciplinary teams, because you can't operate in a modern, very uncertain world and a theatre of battle or whatever, which is very hard to predict, because it's not big Cold War tank battalions, bashing into each other on the North German plains or something. It might be street-to-street fighting in some far-flung part of the world, and you've got to have a team on the ground that is empowered to take action, has the resources within that team to do what it needs to do, and then these broad parameters of mission command and mission objectives. So they're very clear of what they've got to do. They've got the skills to do it. They got the parameters and degrees of freedom within which they know they have to operate, and that's how they operate. But most importantly in all of that too is this idea that, yes, I've also got to teach the leaders how to work at this, to think in these ways, and recognizing, certainly in my view, that leadership is needed at all levels. We've talked about leadership for years. I Googled it the other day because I'm writing a book on some of these ideas. Something like 40,000 books you can find on leadership on Amazon, and yet you ask a lot of people about what's the biggest problem we have, or why can't we be more productive, and they say it's leadership. And you think, so we obviously haven't quite cracked it with all these books then, have we? But I think it comes back to some fundamental ideas, and the first is that, well, okay, so leaders, one of its leaders' primary purpose is to empower, to inspire, to help set vision and direction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that should apply down through the organization. It's not just the CEO. And therefore, I think the dichotomy that we've often created in the past of a language that says, so the leaders are the people who are running the show at the top and everybody else is a manager. Well, I don't believe that's true. I think you've got to build a lot of these leadership type ideas down through the organization. And then you're empowering them. So you may be a first line team supervisor in a customer call center. You've got to be able to work with your team to give a really good service to your customer. And you want those people to be able to make some calls and some judgments in what they are doing as they interact directly with the customer. Not saying, well, I can't answer that. It's got to go through 3 other departments and 5 levels of management before I can get back to you.
Yeah.
So these are really fundamental constructs, I think, of how we should think about business now and how we think about leadership in some different ways as well.
Absolutely, and I think you're spot on with the vision piece as well. That quite often the kind of the 2 sides of it of kind of questions that I ask often new leaders or leaders of first line teams would be, what are the vision and the values and the behaviors of the organization? And quite often it's not naturally coming off the tongue because those were created very much in the past and very much distanced away from them and their job. But then my second favorite question at that point is what's your vision? What are your values and your behaviors for your team? And more importantly for me, did you create those with your team or did you dictate them to your team? I do a lot of coaching with L&D leaders, and that's exactly where we tend to start. Why did you get into L&D? What's the impact you wanted on the world because of what you do, and what's the legacy you want to leave behind? And what does that say about your vision and your values when it comes to leading this team, and how that then ties into the other? And I see a lot of new and frontline leaders now, because I think there's still, for some reason, a lot of the literature you read, and certainly a lot of the things on YouTube as well, the videos and the podcasts around this idea of millennials and how they all want something different, and as if it's another race of people. And a lot of those millennials now, if we still want to call them that, they're very much in those leadership and senior leadership, and quite often entrepreneurial and CEO positions now. So I do see that quite often now that those leaders coming in, they want to do it in a different way. They know there is a different way, quite often, not just because of academic process, because of experiences with different leaders themselves. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there's always that pressure I still think exists for leaders, that when one day you were part of the team and then you go away for the weekend and on the Monday you come back and suddenly you're leading that team. Now, and what's the distinction? What do I need to show on Monday to show now that I am worth the extra X in the pay packet, the new title, and that I am superior to you? And I think there's a clash of that. Is that something you find? And what do you think we could do about that?
Yeah, no, it is. And to be honest, I think one of the reasons why there's a sort of clash is difficult is because we've done a pretty poor job collectively and training people when they take those first steps into a management role. And we tend to promote them, or historically have always promoted them because they're the best technician, the best programmer, the best salesperson. Doesn't necessarily make them a good leader or the best leader. So, something I've long talked about is we have got to do a far better job of teaching and training people as they step up into management roles as to what it means to lead and manage people, because that's the fundamental thing. I mean, if I know that, presumably I got promoted, because I was the best salesperson, so I know how to do selling. So now the question is, do I know how to manage and support people? And do I know how to share my learning with them and coach them and move away from, always doing to a role which is perhaps a bit more supporting and coaching? And those are big shifts, as we already touched on.
Absolutely.
So that's the first one. We've got to train them, and particularly in a world now where what we are trying to lead for are much more diverse teams in every dimension. Diverse because they're probably not all sat in front of us or around us, so they might be working virtually. Diverse because there'll be different ages, different genders, race, ethnicity, their own psychological makeup, experiences, all these sorts of things. So that takes understanding and empathy, and those are coachable and teachable skills. And all the stuff I've done in leadership development, all the stuff I've ever read on it, says that, yeah, you can absolutely develop good leaders. I mean, there's often this dichotomy or this debate, as you know, about are good leaders born or made? And I've always believed that, I mean, some people, of course, are born with perhaps a more inherent emotional intelligence, but you can still teach people to be good managers and leaders. And so that's a very fundamental point. And then to your point about millennials, I think one of the things that we've all observed is the millennials and Gen Zers now come into work, and they expect to have a voice. They expect to be listened to. They look at their manager and they say, you know what, your primary job is to help coach me. Yeah. And that's not the language we were using 20, 30 years ago. If you asked a manager what was their primary role 20, 30 years ago, they would have said, well, it's to make sure stuff gets done, tell people what to do. And I think now we're seeing a generation of thinking about leaders and managers is, no, your fundamental role is to help to get the best out of your people and out of your team. And people even talk about organizational structures being turned on the head, not a pyramid, but an inverted pyramid. Because actually, all of our jobs, you know, as we've moved through the management ranks, is to support the front line. They're the ones that are talking to the customers or trying to sell things or develop the new products and all these other things. So these are, again, quite significant mindset shifts that I think we all need to be aware of.
Definitely. I think nowadays you got those, we talk about the young workers coming into the workplace now, and I think it's never been so easy for people to kind of vote with their feet, as they say. That, you know, it's so easy and relatively cheap and very, very quick to go and set up your own business. It's even very, very easy in terms of work ethic that does exist to run your own business in parallel to the job that you're doing. And I think that is, you know, we talk about the war for talent between companies. I think there's that war in there as well, that people are more likely to use organizations for the stability, the employment, whilst they set up their own thing. And it makes it a much easier choice if they're getting a lot more sort of like the purpose you talked about. They're getting a lot more fulfillment and a lot more energy from doing their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's another sort of interesting dynamic as well. As you said, there's been a lot of sort of research and views as that if you ask younger people what do they want to do, and they'll often say, well, I want to have my own business. And then you say, why do you want that? And they say, because, you know, it gives me freedom. I'll have a voice. I got all these things, right, that we've already touched on. And they think that in coming into a large organization that they're going to disappear in the crowd, as it were. And that's again why it's important on other things we touched on, like the idea of, you know, giving people a voice, giving them autonomy, trusting them and empowering them. You don't take the train wheels off too quickly. You've got to support and guide and teach and train and so forth. But nonetheless, you know, a rather different paradigm than all of this sort of control stuff. So those are reasons also that researchers have talked about when they talk to young people, why do you want your own business? It's because they think they're not going to get voice, or they're going to be very constrained in a larger organization. Now, there are other sides to this story too. I mean, one of which, of course, is that you know, concern about job security, and particularly, again, the pandemic has emphasized that. So, you know, there've been a lot of examples. I haven't seen all the data yet, but I think you know, many small businesses suffering, self-employed people saying, look, I'm going to have to go get a job, even if it may not be my preferred thing. I just need the job security for a period of time. So it'll come and go to some degree with the economic cycles. But I think it's, you know, I think you can replicate many of the things, and you have to, in large organizations, about giving people voice and empowering them properly and coaching them and supporting them and challenging them and stretching them. And then hopefully you can retain their loyalty, but you've also got to show them variety, because the other thing that, you know, I think there is more impatience in the younger generations now to say, well, I'm not just going to keep doing this same old. I want to move on, and why not? So this saying of it's no longer a job for life, it's a life of jobs, and then employers saying, well, that means they're going to leave me. No, it doesn't necessarily. What it means is if you're a larger employer, then think about how you can move people through and around the organization. And again, we haven't been very good at that always. And you find, say, managers saying, well, you can't go anywhere because I depend on you. So the managers themselves, you know, sort of have a vested in keeping people close to them, when actually you need to be saying to the managers, no, part of your job is to nurture and develop talent. We don't want to lose that talent from the organization. So encourage them and support them in finding other roles within the organization when they need and want them. So it's all these sorts of things as well, which I think are part of modern workplace cultures.
And that's a massive one. I mean, I've worked for some large organizations, and there's some very talented people with some great skills, and I say some, lots, because you can think about the kind of scale of things like restructures or office closures that can cause. And yes, all right, there's the process around, can we redeploy somewhere, this, that, and the other, but so much talent is lost through those processes. But I think you're right. Part of it for me comes down to a conversation I have a lot around responsibilities and accountabilities, because I think leadership is very much, in the way you've been describing it, it's very much the skeleton of the organization. It reaches all parts and can guide all parts, control all parts if it needs to, all that sort of stuff. And then I guess in the roles that I've had that have interacted with things like L&D and HR and comms teams and health and safety teams and quality teams, all those sort of things, that they're the subject matter experts. There's always been that kind of standoff point. You're like, well, whose responsibility is health and safety? Whose responsibility is the quality of the work that's being done by the front line? And with all the other teams, whose responsibility is it to make sure that comms has landed? And it's that conversation quite often for me that hasn't happened, or that full communication, because I think that leaders will go, well, hang on a minute, we've got a comms team for that. And the comms team might go, well, hang on a minute, well, there's only 3 of us in the team. There's 6,000 people in the organization. Of course, the leaders need to make sure, but well, who's told the leaders? So, again, your experience, do you think, the definition that I kind of use for this, Peter, is that you can't expect someone to be accountable for something until they've already accepted responsibility for it.
Yeah.
Is that something you find?
I agree, Rob. And yeah, I agree. I mean, and also that you've got to give them the wherewithal. You've got to make sure they're properly resourced and they understand what they're doing, the clarity of objectives and things like that. But the other thing I found really intriguing, going back to this point about rules, is the more rules you write, actually, the more you're in danger of going in the reverse direction. People are not taking accountability because they're just saying, well, I'm acting according to the rules, and the rules have actually constrained me quite tightly. Yeah. There's been a lot of fascinating work done on this in terms of, let's take an accountability that we should all have, which is about acting in morally and ethically responsible ways. I shouldn't be doing things that are harming my customers or whatever. And yet we've seen that happen, haven't we? Because we've created, certainly in the past, I think we're beginning to move beyond this now, but organizations where you couldn't be fully accountable because actually there are so many rules. So I was then acting according to the rules and lost sense of my own personal accountability. And then doing things which actually in hindsight were causing harm. And that's a paradigm that has to shift. But because the point of empowerment, you're right, is about showing people what they're responsible for, equipping them so they can be responsible, so they then take accountability. And it's a very, very important part of understanding sort of ideas of corporate culture.
And again, it ties back into that purpose and passion again, because if you care about something enough, you'll want to be responsible and accountable for it, because you'll want to help it grow and move forward. Absolutely, you will.
But it's also seeing that sort of line of sight, isn't it? I mean, which is why we talked a lot about customer centricity and things like that. And we've all got a line of sight to the customer. And even coming back to your earlier examples like health and safety and quality, those are everybody's responsibilities. I mean, one of the big things that shifted in the thinking around, particularly quality, is you don't inspect quality in at the end and everybody can do what the hell they want. We should all see that as part of our job, is to make sure that our piece of the jigsaw is done to the right standards, the right ways, so that it fits with the other pieces of the jigsaw. And that we're all got that sort of line of sight, as I said, towards the purpose and but also the customer and our wider responsibilities beyond the organization. And those are truly healthy cultures, because then you really are getting the best out of people. And it's been very sad, as I said, to observe some of the failures of corporate cultural failures over the last 20, 30 years in some pretty extraordinary places. because we haven't operated to those principles, and we've kept people in the dark. We told them that's your job, get on with it. Here's the rules, and provided you just sell more money, sell more stuff, even when your customers didn't need it or didn't want it, doesn't matter. You hit the goal, and that's what the goal was. So that's what we all did, and that's the world that we're trying to change. And so the idea of, as you said, purpose and vision and responsibility and accountability, pervades through the organization, and everybody understands they do have a role, and they do have a role to keep things safe, or to ensure that their quality is right, or that the customer is being looked after in the best possible ways. Those should be shared responsibilities. They're not just one team or one individual.
Absolutely, and all those things then weave together. It's in the framework that I've got around leadership. I talk about this, that as a leader, I'm sitting there and I'll have expectations driven from senior leadership, which will tend to be around, again, that kind of performance and results type of mentality. I'll have guidance from HR around the processes and the people. I'll have guidance from L&D in terms of leadership development, the skills I should be having. And then some of the other teams we've just been talking about, the likes of quality and comms and so on and so forth. And what I find, and again, interesting to take your opinion on this, if you've seen this or done any study or work on this, is that I see that because they aren't joined together, those pieces, they often conflict each other. And again, this is where I start getting into a conversation of what gets in the way sometimes. Where are the conflicting motivations? So as a leader, I'm sitting here and I'm going, well, hang on a minute. If I'm sitting here and I'm responsible, if I get a bonus or a target, or the things that you were talking about before, based on my people's bonuses and targets, but at the same time, I'm also now being told, non-targeted, that I need to spend more time coaching and doing one-to-ones, then hang on a minute, we're coming towards the end of the month. Which one of these is my priority right now? Oh, hang on a minute. Well, I don't get scored or targeted on that, on the coaching and the developmental conversations with the team. We're going to crack the whip and get the numbers, so we all could go out for a drink at the end of the quarter.
Yeah.
Do you find that in terms of motivations and goals and bonuses conflicts with what we're trying to do as HR?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, because it's the old adage of what gets measured gets done. And I've debated this many times, and people say, yeah, but there are other things beyond that, but which is true. But if I can't measure it, then how do I really hold people accountable for it? So the question, I think, that's always been in my mind is, so we measure the easy things, right? And it's that old Einsteinian quote of, not everything that counts is counted, and not everything that is counted counts. And a lot of the things that we really need to measure and understand in organizations, we haven't done a very good job of counting or understanding. So if you take those examples, yes, so we've had a persistent business practice of saying, right, the things that I'm going to measure you on and that your reward is linked to are the tangible things that I can measure. So your productivity or your sales output or how many projects you completed or whatever. But you've got to put alongside that what I sometimes describe as the how you did it. So, okay, you hit all your sales numbers, but if you left devastation with your sales teams because you ran them ragged, well, how's that helpful? You might have hit a short-term goal, but you've actually destroyed a lot of long-term value. So then it is about being able to build in more of those measures about people. So it could be things like engagement scores, or it could be how you're building diversity in your team, or it could be 360-degree feedback. How do your people feel that you're coaching and supporting them? Yeah. So they are measurable things, but they then need to be built into our mechanisms of how we understand managers and leaders' behaviors, and then reward those things as well alongside the financial results. And it goes back to many parts of what we've already talked about, Rob, which is this sort of thinking about business and all of our stakeholders, and then finding ways to also measure them so they can be better linked into what we reward for, and that we can keep people's attention on them. And I would say it goes beyond the organization too. I mean, I'm a very strong advocate of the view that businesses should be more transparent, particularly when it comes to transparency about how they manage and develop their people, how they invest in their people, things like diversity and all those things we know are so important. Businesses need to be more transparent, so then we can all see, okay, so now I know that this is important. Yeah. I know that you as a business leader are doing something about it. You're telling me the trajectory you're on. You're telling me the narrative. In other words, what are you doing to improve these things? And that helps to build corporate trust as well, which is really, really important. And I think in today's world, people expect to see that. They expect to see businesses that are acting responsibly, treating their people fairly, building inclusion, and all those other ideas. And we need more measures of that kind.
People are choosing companies, even global companies, to do work with now, even as a customer rather than business based on other factors than price and product. Absolutely. And I think, again, just that engagement you talked about there of people, it needs to be. I think everywhere I've worked in the last 20 years, they've always had the kind of once or twice yearly engagement survey. So it's something that's on the radar. But again, as you to your point, it's never been a key metric or a KPI for a leader to think about that. I mean, I'll keep names out of the following example, but I can remember being in a room full of leaders when an engagement scores came along. The entire team, and it was quite a decent sized team, weren't engaged. I'll oversimplify it for a second, but the engagement was very, very low. Morale was very, very low. And everyone really, as a leadership team, everyone individually was shocked. They didn't see it coming. And there's only myself and one other person that went, no, we kind of expected that. And the reason we expected that, and why I was quite shocked at the other ones, was, doesn't it worry you that you can not have noticed that this many people were disengaged when we have the responsibility to be leading and talking to these people all the time? And I think it is that diversion again of, well, it was the results that matter. I actually tested the water with something on LinkedIn a few weeks ago when I said, NPS is an interesting thing. So we tend to, as senior leaders in organizations, we accept NPS as a comparable, measurable standard around companies. So very simply, as a customer, how likely are you to recommend us to someone else? If we were to put that figure into our leadership matrix, and not upwards, from the top down, from the bottom up. So my people would actually fill out NPS on me. How likely would you be to recommend Rob as a leader to other teams or something? And that then formed part of my target. Suddenly, I'm going to have to focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And which is that, it comes back to what gets measured gets done. I mean, then you know that you're being held accountable for that. But I mean, the engagement's big subject. It's grown hugely as a field. There are many different surveys and ways that people talk about it. But and that's been, to its critics, that's been part of the challenge. I mean, I would love us, it would be great, wouldn't it, if we had a very consistent way of defining it, whether it's NPS or whatever. But I do think, however we define it and describe it and measure it, it should also be something we're transparent about, within the organization and outside the organization as well. And I'll tell you a little anecdote which goes back a few years. And I was talking to the CEO of a very well-known American company, and he said, I'm concerned about the engagement within the business. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, because actually I've been around the business, you get a sense of these things. They certainly look pretty engaged to me, but on the face of it. But he said, we'd run an engagement survey 18 months ago, and then people were saying, well, we don't want to do another one. So he said, I don't know what to think. And I said, well, what did you do with the engagement survey when you last run it? He said, oh, well, I don't know. We talked about it as a management team. I said, well, there's your issue. You can't go off and survey people and then do nothing about it. And so they said, so the organization said, we've not had any feedback and we saw no action. So why would we do it again? Now, of course, I think engagement is also moving on into these more sort of pulse surveys, so we can keep a bit more of a temperature check on what's going on.
Yeah.
But, I have no doubt, and there are some, as I say, some detractors because they say causality and link between engagement and productivity and all those sorts of things. But I've always said, why would you not believe that if people are positively promoting you as a manager or the organization that I work in and feeling positive about it, why would you not believe that's a good thing?
Yeah.
And then however you measure it, then understand it and coach your managers again and see the ways in which you can improve it. And finally, it's also just one of those, again, small ways of people expressing their voice, which is why I said to the CEO, you cannot run a survey and then not tell anybody, because you seem to have given them a voice on the one hand and then taken it away with the other. And hence, I think we're now much more in this space of saying, well, okay, let's have more of these regular conversations with people about how they feel, give them voice, help them feel that they can challenge and raise issues, particularly now when we're trying to create these more inclusive environments, and we're all much more concerned about these deeper facets of organizational culture, which are quite hard to get at. The lived experience, say, of a black person in an organization being different from a white person. And do we actually have some culture here which is in some way inherently racist? Not that we've consciously created it, but the fact that it seems to exist because we haven't understood it well enough. And those are deep and important questions. And so the idea of giving people voice in all of this is a really, really important part of the process. And that voice can come through a whole variety of channels.
Absolutely. And I think, in many different respects, I mean, even down to the kind of trivial nature of just everyday feedback, I've suggested this, that sometimes people feel uncomfortable talking to others about something that's going on in an organization. So that kind of anonymous way of doing it via a survey is an essential part of it. But again, for me, the goal here is to kind of go that, like we have always said about performance management and one-to-ones, that nothing should really come as a surprise, because if it does, what's going on? So, some of the examples you use there, and many more I'm sure there are that people are listening to. How do we get to that point where the leaders that we're talking about, the leadership skills and actions and focuses and priorities, actually encourage people to speak directly to their leaders? And sometimes they don't even need to speak to them directly to start with, because the manager is just noticing it. I'm a big fan of comparing leadership to parenting. And how often do you notice something in your child before they even say anything? Just to kind of think for a second, what is it I do in those circumstances to be able to notice that, compared to work where I just don't notice it.
And which is what people will often talk about as emotional intelligence. But I think particularly in today's day and age, we worry a lot more about things like well-being, about mental health. And we do have a responsibility as organizations to look after our people in these ways. And again, this is about also training managers to be more aware. We can't all be mental health experts, but we just need to be more aware. And we need to be able to know at least how to open up a conversation with somebody who's obviously looking a bit under the weather, and move beyond that sort of rather lazy sort of way of speaking. People say, "How are you today?" and they say, "Fine," and then you just move on. It was just a greeting. I wasn't really asking how you were. Again, I think the pandemic is interesting, isn't it? I think it's created more of that dynamic of caring. We've all understood that this is pretty tough, and we have to really try and engage with our people more to understand how they're feeling and support them better. And so I think this is going to be, again, a big catalyst for putting more front and center. What I believe is one of the most important outcomes of work is that we are looking after people's well-being, their mental, emotional, physical well-being, and that becomes a core driver and indeed a core metric of a healthy and sustainable business. And because at the end of the day, work should be good for us. And then you look at all the trends that have been going on in the workplace. I mean, the CIPD, we do a lot of these sorts of surveys, and we've done a well-being survey over 20 years, and sadly, it's not been particularly improving. It's been getting worse because people have been feeling more stressed out, not listened to well enough, workloads increasing, etc., etc. So we see that things like the biggest cause of long-term absenteeism is stress. And you think, how have we created a world like that? How have we created a world of work like that? And a lot of it, as I said, comes back to so many things we talked about, and training managers to listen and look out and to empathize and to coach and support and so forth. And let's not forget the managers themselves, because often we talk about it's like, well, the manager's got to look after everybody. But they need looking after too. We've all got to look after people at different levels. We've been talking a lot more recently about HR looking after itself, because actually HR, certainly over the last year, has been right in the epicenter of the organizational response, incredibly stressed. So we've got to look after ourselves. We've got to know how to look after ourselves. We've got to look after those people immediately around us, doesn't matter what level of the organization we're at, and then all see that well-being is a collective and shared responsibility, and I think a really important one for the future of work.
Massively so. I mean, HR and L&D teams, again, in my experiences, we've always failed to be our own best case study in these things.
Yeah.
We're full of the great advice, but we, even coming down to developing ourselves, we tended to be not as energetic about doing it for ourselves than we do for others. I guess it really ties in nicely to kind of come into the kind of the last sort of section of what I want you to talk about, really, which was as we start to move forward in the world that we currently are. So, as you know, I said in the message when I reached out to you that I've just completed my CIPD level 7. And I'm at that point where, I've had various pieces of advice before I did it and during it and after it about the credibility of doing it and what it gives you and all that sort of stuff. Now, I will say hand on heart that I've actually found it really useful. I've learned more than I probably thought I would, based on the fact I had a lot of experience prior to that. But I think the major thing for me around it was that those 20 years experience I had that I brought into it, I was able to critique both ways. The theory that's within the content, I was able to say whether I thought that was right or wrong or challenge it because of those experiences. What I would say is that for the kind of younger generation, that's their first experiences of, in fact, they've probably got more experience of the educational side than the practical side of it. How is that enough at the moment? What's the challenges going forward now into this new world? When we look at, and I guess this is the same for you, because you've got leadership best practice, which is, CIPD have got lots of fact sheets on and advice on. And you're actually, though, the real life leader of the organization. What doesn't that tell us? What do we need to kind of come out of the theory theater and really go to?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I'd say is that you can't read everything about work and leadership and how to manage people all out of books. And I think I was observing before as I write lots on the subject, that you can go onto Amazon, and if you Google or go onto Amazon and just search for books on leadership, something like 40,000 of them come up. You think, okay, so there's more written on leadership than any other subject, yet we still seem to be very challenged about it. So what are we not getting right here? And the reality is of course it's that combination of more formal learning plus experiential learning, and an awful lot, I think, particularly when it comes down to subjects like leadership, is as much about experiential learning as there's anything I can sit you in a classroom and teach you. Now, what I can sit you in a classroom and teach you perhaps is to the things to think about, a lot of the things we've talked about here, and some frameworks and models that help you to anchor your experience in different ways.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, an awful lot of things. I mean, you can teach technical skills for sure, but we're all talking about not just leadership. We're all talking much more about this idea of so-called soft skills. I want to hire an attitude and train for skills. I mean, all this sort of thing going on. And what's always been interesting to me is so many of these so-called softer skills. How I lead and work with people, how I think critically, how I find stuff out, how I communicate effectively. All of those things, a lot of them are about experiential learning as well. So it is that combination, and to just sort of echo your thoughts on it. I mean, the reality to me of continued professional development is it is a combination of some of the formal learning and teaching that we might provide as a professional body, but as I said, then reflective learning of your own as you go through the experience of what you do, as you manage teams and you do your day jobs. And it's that combination of things that we need to bring together. And then, of course, in the modern world where, all this debate about, what are the jobs of the future? I mean, the reality of what we're going to have to be able to upskill and reskill, and the idea of lifelong learning become really, really important constructs too. Now, some of that lifelong learning will be about teaching me new skills, technical skills, job skills, because the jobs are changing. Yeah. But I think it's also about a mindset that we always need to see ourselves as learning. And I think a lot of things in the past, probably more in this country than others, has been, well, I did my education, that's great, I'm done, right?
Yeah.
And no, you're not, you're never done. And actually, I think one of the most important attributes, particularly in today's day and age, is to keep being curious, to keep trying to learn new things, to listen to others, to learn from others, to see almost every interaction that we have as an opportunity to learn and to reflect. So it's a mindset as much as anything else. And I think it's particularly important in leaders. And, when I have met many leaders in the past who said, well, we've seen all this before, so this is what we're going to go do. And I said, well, no, you haven't. And what you are reflecting there is a massive experiential bias, plus probably a high degree of arrogance that you think you have seen it all before. So again, I think attributes of modern leaders, we're talking about much more about this humility, about recognizing what we don't know, which is an awful lot, because how could you know it all? About being able to listen more, and then to build teams that complement where you lack the experience or don't have the strengths and so forth. And of course, that will begin with a lot of self-awareness. And that, again, is a very important part of experiential learning. If you're not self-aware, then you're not really going to be learning through the experiences that you have, because you've got nothing much to anchor it to.
Absolutely. Well, my framework starts with, you've got to lead yourself before you can lead others. And that is around understanding yourself and your reactions and your triggers and your legacy and your motivations, all that sort of stuff. And I think you're right. It's bleeding those experiences together. I love my sporting analogies, and quite often we kind of say that, the best football teams are the ones that have some experience within the team, the older heads, and then the younger legs running around it. But, and one can't do what the other does. Bringing that experience together is where it becomes really, really strong. To that point, then, the role of L&D and HR in this now, then, typically it's leadership development that we call it, that we've done in the past. How does that need to change from now on, then? Because I think, and there's a couple of key elements here that I think is important that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. One is, we've spent decades talking about getting a seat at the table. And I think in many organizations, I've seen chief people officers or chief HR officers at that table now, but I still see these conflicts that mean we can't get that mindset to go around the organization. So how do we really push on to that next level? And is it all our role? And
I've long argued
the second part to that, as well, which you might answer at the same time, is in terms of return on investment, management development was one of those things. Again, it so much has been spent on it, and it's very difficult to see what's been brought back into it. Is that one of the reasons why people are reluctant to do it, and how do we do that better?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. First of all, as I said, we haven't invested actually enough in management training in the sense of what we've been talking about. A lot of this sort of people management, communication skills, and be able to express vision, having a clear, teachable point of view of your own, all those sorts of things which people look for in their leaders. And where we have done management training, it's often been, I've been on them myself, you'd be taught all about strategy and finance and market understanding and competitor analysis, which I'm not saying are not good skills. Of course, they're important skills, but we haven't done enough of the skills actually that most of your people are looking to you for, which is, can you coach me? Can you lead me? Have you got a vision? You've got a point of view, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, that then comes back to, so how do I develop those skills? And as I said before, to some extent, you can teach some of those. You can help give people some frameworks. You can help, obviously, through assessment techniques to make them more self-aware of where their strengths and weaknesses are, all of those sorts of things. But I do think that it needs to be thought of in a more holistic way, and that leadership development is not just what you sit in a classroom and learn. And indeed, I think too much in the past, we felt that was it. And as long as I aimed a fire hose at people and sprayed them with a whole bunch of things that they're supposed to do and thinking about all these habits they're going to change, it'll be fine. But actually, that is not how you learn. And then particularly when it comes to these sorts of skill sets. So I think neuroscience has taught us a lot more about how people learn, how you change your habits. It takes many repetitions, and it takes experience, and it takes continual reminders. So it is seeing leadership development in a much more holistic way. It is seeing that it is vital. And then to come back to L&D and HR, I've been saying for a while now that I think learning and development in its widest sense, the formal learning and the less formal learning and developmental stuff, is an absolute strategic competence of an effective business. In a world that's changing at the rate it is around us, where you've got to upskill and reskill, you've got to try and embed these cultures and behaviors in different ways. The ability to do that well, with a really good L&D function, never be more strategic. And so to me, it is a strategic competence of an organization that can do these things well. And then finally, you've got, of course, the opportunity that we have in L&D now to do it very differently. With all this digital stuff, we can enable learning in very different ways, and embedding, particularly around job skills, embedding a lot of the learning in the flow of work. Whether you're using AR and VR and all these other things, or you're building the learning somehow into the processes of work, and that's very important, because we know that actually that's the best way to learn. And putting somebody in a classroom and saying, right, you need to learn all of this stuff, and then 6 weeks later, when they actually need to use it, by which time they've forgotten it. Well, that's not the way you embed learning, and yet that's a lot of what we've done in the past, isn't it?
It's
and
then also
about
I think the stakeholders in the past, and as I say on pretty much every episode of this podcast, I'll hold my hand up. I've made many of these similar mistakes, but it's a case of we can't let them on the phones, for example, until they've had all that training, but they're not going to remember it. But it doesn't matter. It becomes that kind of tick box.
Yeah, but then if it's say somebody being on a phone in a call center, then you can now, of course, have all the information coming up to them as they're on the call. We've long passed a world where with voice recognition you can pick up keywords, you can show them to the call center agent that this is what you should say, this is how you should respond. I mean, there are lots of ways of embedding learning into the flow of work. But I think also this other analogy I've used quite a lot, is particularly with the younger generations, is they get very frustrated with corporate learning when they will go Google things. And I've said often to HR and L&D people, if somebody has a problem in the world of work, it might be something like, how do I deal with a difficult colleague? What do you think their first instinct is to do? Now, they might go and ask somebody, but more likely than not, they just go Google it and see what's out there. Do you think that they're actually going to sit down and say, I wonder if there's a course somewhere in the corporate learning curriculum that I could go on that would teach me that? So in other words, we've got to think about learning in this very immediate way, and we've got to create sort of Google-like experiences, and there are other search engines. But we've got to create these experiences for access to knowledge and content and learning, which is more immediate and accessible, which doesn't mean to say that we will never go back to classrooms. But I think it's seeing, as I said, that learning and development is a very holistic experience. It's not just something that happens in these rather formalized settings which we've created in the past. And that we know, therefore, as I said, from neuroscience and other things, that people will retain their knowledge far better if it's delivered at the point of need. They can then repeat and learn, and then it's built from experience as much as it is built by somebody standing up in front of them and telling them what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, it's at that point of need, and it's the reactions and emotional connection to what they needed when they need it that fires it. I mean, my take on learning is that I say that learning is very much like oxygen and breathing, that it's always happening, whether we like it or not. And our role as a leader is to kind of guide that and say, this is how we want to go down that route, or use that learning, or how we need to use it today. And I think, language for me, I think we've turned from training teams to learning development teams. And I think the word performance needs to come more in that now, because, as a stakeholder, we go, well, you're going to help me with my people's learning because you're an L&D team. But if it suddenly was performance, it's, well, you're going to help me with that performance then, surely.
Definitely. And to your earlier point, that one of the reasons we've been challenged a bit is, particularly in L&D, about learning spend, and it's always a soft target, is because we haven't talked about it in those terms, and we haven't really been able to, clearly evaluate the outcomes of learning. And there's an old saying about marketing, which is that, well, I know that at least half my marketing is adding value. I just don't know which half. And I've always said that's true of learning too. I think most leaders I've talked to would accept that learning is important, but they don't really know. They couldn't pinpoint it and say, well, which part of the learning is important? And that's because, to be honest, we as the professionals in the space haven't been able to do that very well ourselves. And we've focused again, to my point about what's easy to measure. So we'll measure the attendance, we'll measure, do they like the training, and stuff like that. And that is not what you're trying to understand. What you need to understand is, Yeah, but what difference did it make? What was the learning objective? And can I see that the learning interventions that I provided actually improved their ability to manage their people or whatever it was? And we really need to get better at that to, first and foremost, to be able to direct the learning and the interventions that we have in the right way, and then to revisit them when they're not delivering those right outcomes, and be quite prepared to start again if that's what we need to do. But also, of course, to be able to convince everybody else and say, this is where the value comes from learning. This is why we need to do it. So don't chop that budget. And that's, I think, very much in our gift. And I think it's a very important part of the development of L&D and HR is that we've got to get better on the analytics and the data and the proof points, so that we really can show the value of what we do and start to talk more about the value of people through their performance and all the things that drive that.
Well, it's timely that you say that today, actually, because again, today I put a post out there onto social around learning and performance, and gone, take the last course that you wrote or the last learning needs analysis out there. So learning needs analysis and learning objectives, I think you just said there, and replace the words with performance. So what were the performance objectives for that course or that e-learning? And then very suddenly, if you look at the list and go, oh my God, that that just they aren't performance objectives. Why are we doing what we're doing? I think that was a fascinating conversation. And I think, having to focus on that. And I think also, without being too trivial about it, having L&D and HR having that kind of backbone to stand up for what they truly believe are the problems, because there are teams in organizations that make customer journeys so much easier than first line agent journeys and frontline worker journeys. So be able to go, forget the learning for a second, you're not going to get the performance unless you improve the standard of leadership and the systems and whatever it might be. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground there, Peter. It's a fantastic conversation. There's one last thing for us to do based on what we've been talking about. Obviously, the podcast is called Leadership Untitled. And that's for us now to just quickly go, based on what we've been talking about, what do we think would be a good title for the episode? Have you got any thoughts there based on the journey we've had?
Yeah, I've sometimes talked about it, Rob, as 21st century leadership, the new era of leadership, because as I said, I think so many of the paradigms of leadership we've had in the past, we're really trying to challenge, whether it's a paradigm of command and control, or even how we become leaders, or what's important as leaders. The ideas of leaders as listening and several. So I sometimes describe it as 21st century leadership, or the new era of leadership, or something like that. Because we need to make these shifts. I think the encouraging thing to me is I'm seeing a lot of these shifts happening much more now. I think there's a much bigger appreciation of so much of what we've talked about. And as I said before, I think the pandemic will act as a catalyst. I don't think anybody could come away from the pandemic and not understand that looking after your people first and foremost wasn't one of your most important things to do. It's broken down lots of hierarchies and silos and many other things, and those are all things that we need to think about. But I sometimes like to think, as I said, in terms of these sorts of eras of thinking, and I think we went through a long period, through the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties to some degree, of these paradigms of work and business. Business about making money, and everything else kind of didn't matter so much. And we didn't see our collective responsibilities as leaders. We didn't empower people properly. We weren't listening to them. Teaching and training managers to be good people managers, and seeing leadership up and down the structures, and all of those ideas really started to emerge in my experience in the last sort of 10 years or so. And with all of that, you need different leaders who can think and act and work differently. But as I said, I think we're seeing it, and I think we're seeing some good positive movement in those directions. Now's the time to give it a good positive shove.
Absolutely, couldn't agree more. And I like the idea of 21st century leadership. I think that's what we'll go for there, 100%. If people would like to follow what you do and say more, are you active on any particular social channels so people can connect to you?
Yeah, I'm LinkedIn and Twitter. You can find me on there. I obviously blog a lot, write a lot. I'm just finished the manuscript of a new book, which I think is going to be called the New World of Work, which is looking at lots of these dimensions of what's driving the modern world of work. Obviously a lot about technology, but also social and demographic change, cultural shifts, all these things we've talked about. And it is genuinely a fascinating time. I mean, all my time in business, I don't think quite literally has ever been such a confluence of different ideas, different thinking. Obviously, you have crises, not just the pandemic, but the environmental crisis and stuff, all this stuff coming together. And if that doesn't force us to think differently about some of these things, then nothing will. So, it's that old adage, to some degree, don't let a good crisis go to waste, or that, the idea that crisis represents, of course, it represents real challenge, and it's been very hard. And I wouldn't want anybody to think that I'm being crass about the pandemic we've gone through. It's been horrendous for so many people. But I think we have to also look ahead and say, okay, so what have we learned from this, and how do we improve? And I think genuinely we can, and that I think, as I said, this crisis and the crises we're in will act as catalysts for positive change, because they have to.
Absolutely. A lot of things we've been talking about for years, like flexible working to climate, to all those sort of things. And it's just, we've just had to do it now. The cost associated with it, or whatever it might be, we've had to do it and change. Well, brilliant. I think that's a really good note to end on there for us, Peter. I want to thank you again for agreeing to come on today, and for what I think it's been a really enthralling conversation from my end, and I hope it has been for you too.
Yeah, so I always love talking about these things. As you can probably hear, I could talk about them forever. I mean, they're really important. They're equally fascinating too. I think it's just, again, come back to that theme I said about being curious. I think we should all look around us and see what's going on. And so, there's some good things. Now let's help them, really accelerate.
Well, based on that, I might ask you to come back for a part 2 at some point. We'll get people to jot down some questions that they'd like to ask. We'll do it as a Q&A or something like that. Perfect. Sure. Well, thank you very much, and have a great day, and we'll speak again soon, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Take care.
Bye-bye. So that brings us to the end of this episode of the Leadership Untitled podcast. This episode will be called 21st Century Leadership. All that remains is for me to thank again Peter Cheese for sharing all his experience and insights about what the future holds for L&D and HR and leaders. And also thank you, the listener, for tuning in today to listen to our conversation. Please, if you've not subscribed, please do so you don't miss future episodes. And if you want to get in contact to get any help on maybe leading or pushing your L&D and leadership team out this way, then please do so. Look at www.robmoores.com or get in touch with me via the LinkedIn channels and email. Speak soon.